Welcome back, you guys. Today I'm going to show you how to make this mirror glaze frog cake. So this is actually a throwback to a cake I made a few years ago, but I wanted to remake it now that I'm doing a little bit more of in-depth tutorials. This is made with one batch of my vanilla layer cake recipe, and these are 7-inch cake rounds. I added some green gel food coloring to my cake batter just to give it a really vibrant color, but this is just regular vanilla cake. If you wanted to and you had a really great green flavor in mind, like lime or something like that, you could definitely add that into this cake, but I just stuck with vanilla on this one. Once I had stacked all 4 of my cake layers, I began to trim my top cake layer just to give it a little bit of a rounded edge to help make the frog's head. So this is just using a serrated knife, and I'm really just letting the knife work through the cake layers. I'm not applying a lot of pressure. Once I had rounded that top layer, I removed all of my extra cake scraps, and I then began to work on my crumb coat. Just like on my regular cakes, I like to start with a really big dollop of frosting on top of the cake, which I slowly work down using a large offset spatula. So for this cake, I worked on really getting the top of it nice and rounded, and then I slowly spread it down to the base of the cake. To get my crumb coat really perfectly smooth, I used an acetate sheet. I used a tiny bit of my batter to make a 6-inch cake layer, which I cut in half, just leveling it through the middle. And I then cut out 2 small circles. So these are going to become the frog's eyes. And then for the rest of this layer, I'm going to cut 2 long rectangles, which are going to become the frog's front legs. With the other layer, I'm going to trim off one side and then cut this in half to create the frog's hind legs. To create the rest of the eyes, I used some circle cutouts and some black and white fondant to create the cute animated eyes and those little nostrils. I frosted the cutouts for the eyes using some green frosting in a piping bag and my turntable. So I frosted each eye individually, and once I had covered it in frosting, I used a small offset spatula to get it really nice and smooth. Then it was time to start adding our legs onto our frog. So I used a bit of buttercream to secure the cake pieces that we cut out, and I then covered them with some extra frosting, just to make everything kind of mesh together and blend in. This step is definitely easiest if you're using a piping bag, just because some of those angles are kind of hard to get frosting into, and you don't want to apply too much pressure to the cake. So using a piping bag makes this so much easier. Once my legs were nice and secure, I started to add some green frosting around this cake. So I used 2 different types of green. One was a bit darker and one was a lighter green. And I then worked this frosting all the way around the cake. The goal here is really just to create a great green base for when we pour the glaze over the cake. So I worked this all the way around the cake, covering all of that white frosting, and I then smoothed this as much as I could using an acetate sheet. I also heated up an offset spatula and went over any lines to get this really nice and smooth. That's what gives it this kind of like shine and this interesting look right now. I also added on the frog's little webbed toes using a piping bag. At this point in time, I popped the cake into the fridge to let it chill, and I worked on the mirror glaze. So this is just my microwave mirror glaze recipe, which is super easy, and it's only 5 ingredients. The recipe is up on Chelsweets.com, and I'm also including the link below in the video description. If you want a really in-depth view at how to make it, you can also watch the tutorial, which I've linked in the upper right corner. Once my mixture was really nice and smooth, I divided it between 3 bowls, and I added some different types of green gel food coloring to give this glaze a little bit of depth once we mix it all together. So this first green is a very light shade of green, and it's kind of going to be the base. The next color was more of a forest green. It was definitely a deeper shade. And my final bowl, I colored kind of a lime green. So these colors are very interesting, but when you get them all together, it's going to look really fun when we pour it over the cake. Once my mirror glaze got around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, I poured all of them together in my main mixing bowl, which you can't really tell because that dark green kind of sinks in, but I reserved a tiny bit of the mixture, which I added some black gel food coloring to, and I then took this super dark mixture and I drizzled it over my main bowl. So this is going to create some really fun kind of marbling once we pour it over the cake. Now comes the really fun part, pouring this over our chilled cake. So it's important that your cake is really chilled when you do this so that the buttercream doesn't melt and so that the cake can keep its shape. As you can see, I've also propped up my cake on a cake pan so that any excess mirror glaze will just run right off and into my pan that I've placed underneath. Next, I added on the frog's eyes. So those circle cake rounds that we made earlier, I added some skewers into, and I'm just propping them right on top of the cake. After adding the frog's nostrils, I also spooned a little bit of mirror glaze on top of the eyeballs just so that the entire cake was really nice and shiny. I let the cake continue to drip for about 10 minutes, and once I felt like the mirror glaze had begun to set, I used an acetate sheet to scrape away that excess mirror glaze from around the cake base. And just like that, our mirror glaze frog cake is complete. I really feel like I should call it like a slimy frog or something, but it doesn't sound quite as fun. So now it's time for the best part. We gotta cut into this cake. I'm using my really fun iridescent knife just because I didn't really have a plain green knife, and this cake is so fun that it really seemed kind of on theme. I'm cutting a really big slice out of the back of this cake so that you guys can see those really vibrant green cake layers that we made this cake with. So as you can see, we've got a really beautiful cake that is green through and through. Thanks so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed this tutorial, be sure to click the like button and the subscribe button if you don't already. And also, don't forget to let me know what cakes you'd like to see me make next.